She thought she was simply helping a lonely old man buy his groceries. But before the sun set, the most feared man in the city would discover that a stranger had given his grandfather something money had failed to buy for years. Arthur Bennett stood quietly in checkout lane 6, his weathered hands resting on the handle of a faded shopping cart that held little more than a loaf of wheat bread, a carton of milk, a can of tomato soup, fresh apples, oatmeal, and a small bottle of heart medication. The fluorescent lights above reflected against the polished floor as shoppers hurried around him, too busy with their own lives to notice the elderly man studying the total on the register with silent disappointment. The cashier smiled politely but waited, watching Arthur reach into the inside pocket of his worn brown jacket and slowly count a handful of neatly folded dollar bills. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from age. When he finished counting, he looked at the display once more before offering a gentle smile that carried no bitterness. "That's all right," he said softly. "You can take the medicine off. I'll come back another day." The young cashier hesitated. "Sir, are you sure?" Arthur nodded. "I've managed before." Behind him, a woman quietly observed everything without saying a word. Amara Johnson had just finished a 10-hour shift cleaning offices across downtown Chicago. Her sneakers were beginning to wear thin, her shoulders ached, and the reusable grocery bag hanging from her arm contained little more than rice, eggs, frozen vegetables, and a package of discounted chicken she had carefully chosen because every dollar mattered. She had exactly $63 left until payday, and half of that would disappear into her mother's prescription refill the following morning. She could have looked away. Most people did. Instead, she stepped forward with calm certainty. "Please leave everything on the order," she said, placing her debit card beside the register before Arthur could protest. The cashier blinked in surprise. Arthur turned slowly, his blue eyes filled with confusion. "Miss, I couldn't possibly let you do that." Amara offered the kind of smile that came naturally to people who had learned compassion long before comfort. "You don't have to let me. Just promise you'll take your medicine home today." Arthur stared at her for several seconds, searching her face as though trying to understand why a complete stranger would spend money she obviously couldn't spare. There was no camera pointed toward them, no crowd applauding, no expectation of recognition. She simply waited while the payment processed, tucked the receipt into his grocery bag, and gently handed him the handles of the cart. "Take care of yourself," she said before lifting her own bag and walking toward the automatic doors without asking his name or expecting gratitude. Arthur remained motionless, watching her disappear into the cool evening as sunlight painted long golden reflections across the parking lot. Inside, the black luxury SUV parked quietly across the street. A security specialist lowered a pair of binoculars and spoke into a discreet radio. "Sir," he said carefully, never taking his eyes off the woman walking away with tired but steady steps. "I think there's something you should see." Amara Johnson never thought of herself as extraordinary. Every weekday began at 5:30 in the morning inside a modest apartment on the west side of Chicago, where the sound of an old coffee maker filled the tiny kitchen before sunrise. She carefully packed her lunch into a reusable container, checked that her mother's medication sat beside a glass of water, and quietly slipped out the front door while most of the neighborhood was still asleep. By 6:30, she was already riding the city bus downtown, passing rows of towering glass buildings that reflected a world she felt she only borrowed during working hours. She spent her mornings polishing conference rooms, disinfecting desks, emptying trash cans, and wiping fingerprints from windows that overlooked million-dollar views she would never own. Few executives noticed the woman who made their offices sparkle before they arrived, and those who did rarely remembered her name. That never seemed to bother her. Amara believed respect was measured by character rather than recognition. During lunch, she often sat alone on a bench overlooking the Chicago River, reading library books while eating homemade sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. She never complained about working overtime because every additional hour meant another bill paid, another prescription filled, another week her mother could rest without worrying about money. Even after finishing her office cleaning shift, she spent 3 evenings each week helping at a neighborhood community center, organizing donated clothing, and preparing care packages for struggling families. Nobody asked her to volunteer. Nobody offered her publicity or rewards. She simply believed that kindness should never depend on convenience. What few people knew was that life had tested that belief more than once. 5 years earlier, after her father passed away unexpectedly from heart disease, Amara had postponed her own dreams of finishing nursing school to care for her family. The savings she had spent years building disappeared within months under hospital invoices, rent payments, and grocery receipts. Friends encouraged her to think about herself for once, but every time she looked at her mother's tired smile, she quietly chose responsibility over ambition. She never considered herself unlucky. She often said that gratitude cost nothing, even when everything else did. As evenings settled across the city, she carried her groceries up 3 flights of narrow apartment stairs. Her mother, Evelyn Johnson, looked up from her favorite chair and smiled warmly. "Did you remember to buy yourself something sweet this week?" she asked. Amara laughed softly while placing the groceries onto the kitchen counter. "Maybe next paycheck." She carefully unpacked the milk, bread, vegetables, and chicken before noticing the smaller amount remaining in her checking account through her banking application. The payment at the grocery store had left her with barely enough to reach Friday, yet her expression never changed. She closed the application, prepared dinner, and spent the rest of the evening listening to her mother talk about old family memories as rain gently tapped against the apartment windows. Across the city, Arthur Bennett slowly entered a sprawling stone estate surrounded by towering oak trees and wrought iron gates. Uniformed staff greeted him respectfully, but he barely acknowledged them. Instead, he walked into a quiet library where framed family photographs covered the walls. Moments later, a tall man wearing a tailored navy suit stepped inside. His sharp features softened the instant he saw his grandfather sitting comfortably in the leather chair. Lorenzo DeLuca had negotiated multi-million-dollar deals without showing emotion, yet one glance at Arthur's thoughtful expression immediately caught his attention. Before Lorenzo could ask how the afternoon had gone, Arthur looked up with an unfamiliar smile and quietly said, "Today I met someone who reminded me that genuine kindness still exists, and she had absolutely no idea who I was." Lorenzo DeLuca listened without interrupting, something that almost never happened during business meetings. His grandfather rarely spoke about strangers, and when he did, there was always a reason. Arthur rested both hands on the carved wooden cane beside his chair before carefully placing the folded grocery receipt on the coffee table. "She spent money she could not afford," he said quietly. "I could see it in the way she looked at every item in her own bag before she paid for mine." Lorenzo lowered his eyes toward the receipt, then back to Arthur. "Did she ask for your name?" Arthur smiled and slowly shook his head. "No." "Did she recognize the security team?" "No." "Did she expect anything in return?" Arthur leaned back, gazing toward the rain sliding down the library windows. "She only asked me to take my medicine home." The room became unusually quiet. Lorenzo had spent most of his adult life surrounded by people who expected something. Business partners expected influence. Rivals expected weakness. Politicians expected favors. Charities expected donations. Even friends often expected access. Genuine generosity without calculation had become so rare that he almost questioned whether it still existed. Arthur broke the silence again. "Find out who she is, Lorenzo. Not because she helped me. Find out because people like her should never go unnoticed." Lorenzo nodded once before pressing a discreet button beneath the edge of the table. Less than a minute later, his chief of security entered the library carrying a digital tablet. "I need everything about the woman who paid for my grandfather's groceries," Lorenzo said calmly. "Use the grocery store cameras, parking lot footage, traffic cameras if necessary. I want facts, not assumptions." The security chief gave a respectful nod and quietly left the room. Before sunrise the following morning, an organized file already rested on Lorenzo's desk. He opened it while the first light spread across the skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The report contained no scandals, no hidden wealth, and no suspicious connections. Instead, it revealed something far more unexpected. Amara Johnson, 34 years old, full-time commercial cleaning employee, part-time volunteer at a neighborhood community center. No criminal record. No unpaid debts beyond a manageable medical payment plan for her mother. Perfect attendance at work for nearly 4 years. Multiple commendations from supervisors for honesty after returning valuable items left behind by clients. Lorenzo continued reading. One paragraph caught his attention more than the others. 3 months earlier, Amara had found an envelope containing nearly $4,000 in cash inside an executive office after a corporate event. Security footage showed her immediately turning it over without opening it. The money belonged to a visiting consultant who had not even realized it was missing until later that evening. Lorenzo quietly closed the file and stared out across the city. Most people protected their integrity when someone was watching. Very few protected it when nobody expected them to. Another page described anonymous grocery deliveries made every month to an elderly widow living 6 blocks from Amara's apartment. Payment records showed they always came from Amara's personal account. She had never spoken about it publicly. She had never mentioned it during interviews. She simply continued doing it month after month. Lorenzo slowly smiled, almost surprised by his own reaction. "Interesting," he murmured. Arthur entered the study carrying 2 cups of coffee and noticed the expression immediately. "You found her." Lorenzo accepted 1 cup before answering. "I found someone who behaves the same way in private that she does in public." Arthur nodded knowingly. "That is called character." Lorenzo looked once more at Amara's photograph clipped neatly to the report. She was standing outside the community center in a simple blue jacket, smiling at a little girl holding a donated backpack. There were no cameras positioned for publicity, no reporters nearby, only an ordinary woman quietly improving someone else's day. For reasons he could not yet explain, Lorenzo closed the folder with unusual care. He had built an empire by learning how to read people, but something told him that understanding Amara Johnson would require more than an investigation. It would require seeing the world through eyes that had never measured another person's worth by power or wealth. 3 days passed, yet Lorenzo DeLuca found himself thinking about Amara Johnson far more often than he expected. It was not because she had helped his grandfather. People occasionally did generous things. What unsettled him was the consistency of her character. Every report he received told the same story. She treated everyone with the same quiet respect regardless of who they were. There were no dramatic gestures, no speeches, no desire for recognition. It was simply the way she lived. On Thursday morning, Lorenzo closed another business meeting earlier than planned and looked toward his head of security. "Cancel my afternoon appointments," he said. The man looked surprised. "Sir." Lorenzo stood, slipping on a charcoal jacket instead of one of his usual tailored suits. "I want to see her myself." Less than an hour later, a modest gray pickup truck rolled into the parking lot outside the downtown office building where Amara worked. Without the expensive convoy that normally followed him, Lorenzo looked like any successful businessman passing through the neighborhood. He remained inside the truck while watching employees enter and leave through the service entrance. At precisely 12:15, Amara walked outside carrying the same reusable lunch container and paperback novel she always brought to work. She crossed the street and sat on the familiar bench overlooking the Chicago River. Lorenzo observed quietly from a distance. She ate slowly, occasionally smiling at people walking their dogs or office workers enjoying the sunshine. Then something unexpected happened. A young construction worker accidentally dropped his wallet while hurrying across the sidewalk, never noticing it had fallen beneath the bench. Several pedestrians stepped around it without stopping. Amara noticed almost immediately. She picked it up, looked around, and spotted the young man nearly half a block away. Without hesitation, she called after him. When the city noise swallowed her voice, she jogged after him instead. By the time she caught up, the young man had already begun searching his pockets with growing panic. Amara held out the wallet with an easy smile. Relief flooded across his face. "I thought I had lost everything," he admitted. "My identification, my paycheck, everything." He reached into the wallet and pulled out a folded $100 bill. "Please, at least let me thank you." Amara gently shook her head. "Keep it. You earned it. Just make sure you celebrate by doing something kind for someone else when you have the chance." Before he could answer, she wished him a good afternoon and quietly returned to her bench as though nothing unusual had happened. Lorenzo watched the entire exchange through the windshield. She never looked around to see whether anyone had noticed. She never expected praise. She simply returned to her sandwich and opened her book where she had left off. Something about that ordinary moment stayed with him. It reminded him of conversations he used to have with his grandmother before she passed away, when she insisted that the strongest people were not the loudest, but the ones who chose kindness when no reward existed. That evening, Lorenzo drove to Arthur's estate instead of returning directly home. Arthur was tending to the roses behind the house when Lorenzo approached. "You were right," Lorenzo admitted quietly. Arthur smiled without looking up from the flowers. "You met her?" Lorenzo nodded. "She does not know anyone is watching, yet she never changes." Arthur gently clipped another rose before speaking again. "Power reveals character, Lorenzo, but so does having none." Lorenzo looked across the peaceful garden as those words settled into his thoughts. For the first time in many years, he realized he was no longer investigating Amara Johnson. Without even noticing when it had happened, he had begun learning from her. The following Saturday arrived wrapped in crisp autumn air, and downtown Chicago buzzed with weekend shoppers carrying steaming coffee cups and colorful shopping bags beneath rows of golden trees. Amara had promised her mother that she would stop by the neighborhood farmers market before heading to the community center, hoping to find fresh vegetables at lower prices before volunteering for the afternoon. Across the street, Lorenzo watched from inside the same gray pickup truck, dressed in faded jeans, a dark flannel shirt, and a worn baseball cap that concealed the face recognized by nearly every influential person in the city. Only one trusted security driver knew where he was, parked several blocks away, and instructed not to interfere unless absolutely necessary. Lorenzo wanted no special treatment, no invisible protection around Amara, only the opportunity to understand whether her kindness truly came from instinct or circumstance. As Amara wandered through the outdoor market, comparing prices with careful attention, an elderly vendor accidentally knocked over an entire display of apples when one unstable wooden crate slipped from the folding table. Bright red fruit scattered across the sidewalk, rolling between hurried shoppers who simply stepped around them to avoid slowing down. The vendor sighed with obvious frustration, bending carefully despite the stiffness in his back. Before Lorenzo could even reach for the truck door, Amara had already set down her grocery bag and hurried forward. Without saying a word, she knelt on the cold pavement, gathering apples one by one, while smiling reassuringly at the embarrassed vendor. Soon a little boy tugged on his mother's sleeve and joined her, followed by another customer, then another, until complete strangers were helping because one woman had quietly decided that someone else's problem mattered. Within minutes, the entire display stood neatly rebuilt. The grateful vendor reached beneath the table and handed Amara a large paper bag filled with fresh produce. "Please," he insisted warmly, "take these. It is the least I can do." Amara looked inside before gently returning the bag with both hands. "Thank you," she said sincerely, "but someone else might need these more than I do today." She selected only 2 tomatoes she had originally planned to purchase, paid their full price, wished the vendor a wonderful weekend, and continued walking without another thought. Lorenzo remained completely still inside the truck. He had expected kindness once, perhaps even twice. But what he continued witnessing felt less like isolated generosity and more like the rhythm of her everyday life. Later that afternoon, he followed from a respectful distance as Amara arrived at the community center carrying several grocery bags. Instead of keeping the discounted fruit she had purchased for herself, she quietly sliced the apples into small portions for children attending the weekend reading program, laughing with them as though she had not spent the entire week working exhausting shifts. No cameras documented the moment. No organization posted photographs online. The only reward she received was the joyful laughter echoing through the brightly painted room. Standing outside the entrance, Lorenzo realized something unexpected had happened inside him. He had originally searched for proof that her compassion was genuine. Now he found himself hoping he would never discover anything that proved otherwise. As the afternoon sunlight filtered through the center's windows, Arthur's words returned once again with remarkable clarity. "Power reveals character, but so does having none." Lorenzo slowly smiled to himself because, for the first time in years, he understood that the strongest person he had met did not command respect with influence, wealth, or fear. She earned it every ordinary day through choices so small that almost nobody else ever noticed. Monday morning arrived beneath a blanket of gray clouds that left the city wrapped in cool mist and quiet streets. Amara stepped off the bus with a travel mug of homemade coffee warming her hands as she walked the familiar 3 blocks toward the office building she cleaned every weekday. She noticed a man standing near the entrance, studying a folded street map with obvious uncertainty. His flannel shirt looked worn from years of use, and a small duffel bag rested beside his feet. It was Lorenzo, though nothing about him suggested wealth or influence. He had carefully chosen ordinary clothes once again, determined to answer one final question for himself. Would Amara still show the same compassion if the person before her appeared to have nothing to offer? She slowed her pace when she saw the concern on his face. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. Lorenzo looked up with a polite smile. "I was supposed to meet someone for a maintenance job, but I think I wrote down the wrong address. My phone died, and I cannot seem to figure out where I am going." Amara glanced at the map before checking the time on her watch. She was already running a few minutes late, something that almost never happened, yet she never looked frustrated. Instead, she studied the street names, smiled, and pointed toward a bus stop across the intersection. "You are almost 2 miles away from the building you need. If you catch the number 22 bus, it will stop less than a block from the address." Lorenzo nodded appreciatively, but remained standing. "I do not think I have enough cash for the fare." Without hesitation, Amara reached into her jacket pocket and removed the reloadable transit card she kept for emergencies. "Take this," she said. "There is enough balance for several rides." Lorenzo shook his head. "I could never accept that." She laughed softly. "Then think of it as a loan from one Chicago commuter to another. Someday you can help someone else." Before he could answer, she scribbled the bus route on the back of a grocery receipt she found inside her bag. "The driver will tell you where to get off if you ask." Lorenzo accepted the card, slowly, studying her expression. There was no trace of hesitation, suspicion, or expectation. She had simply decided that solving another person's problem mattered more than protecting her own convenience. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "You have already done more than enough." Amara smiled. "I hope your day gets better from here." She hurried toward the building entrance, arriving several minutes late for the first time in nearly 4 years. Her supervisor noticed immediately, but simply nodded after hearing that she had stopped to help someone find his destination. "That sounds like you." The supervisor replied with an understanding smile before returning to work. Across the street, Lorenzo remained standing beside the bus stop long after Amara disappeared inside. He looked down at the transit card resting in his hand. It was old, slightly scratched, and clearly well used. To anyone else it was worth only a few dollars. To him it represented something impossible to purchase. A person with limited means had trusted a complete stranger without asking for identification, guarantees, or repayment. When the city bus finally arrived, Lorenzo stepped aboard, tapped the borrowed card against the fare reader, and quietly took a seat beside the window. As the bus pulled away, he looked back toward the office building where Amara had already disappeared into another ordinary workday. For the first time in many years, Lorenzo realized he was no longer searching for proof of her goodness. The evidence had become impossible to ignore. The only question remaining was whether someone like Amara Johnson would ever believe that her smallest acts of kindness had already begun changing the heart of a man the entire city believed could never change. Tuesday evening arrived with the sky painted in soft shades of orange and gold as Amara finished another long shift and stepped onto the familiar city bus for the ride home. Halfway through the trip, her phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. She almost ignored it, assuming it was another telemarketing call, but something prompted her to answer. "Miss Johnson," an elderly voice asked warmly. "This is Arthur Bennett. We met at the grocery store a few days ago." Amara smiled immediately. "Of course I remember you. How are you feeling?" Arthur chuckled gently. "Much better, thanks to someone who insisted I take my medicine home." His voice carried the calm confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime choosing his words carefully. "I was hoping you might allow an old man to thank you properly. Would you join me for dinner tomorrow evening?" Amara hesitated. "That is very kind, but you really do not owe me anything." "Perhaps," Arthur replied, "but you would be doing me a favor. My family is always busy, and I would enjoy sharing a meal with someone who reminds me that good conversations still exist." After a brief pause, she agreed. The following evening she borrowed her favorite navy blue dress, one she had worn only twice before, and arrived at the address Arthur had texted her. As the taxi turned onto a quiet tree-lined avenue, she noticed elegant stone walls stretching farther than she expected. A pair of ornate iron gates slowly opened without anyone stepping outside. Beyond them stood a magnificent estate surrounded by perfectly trimmed gardens, fountains reflecting the fading sunlight, and rows of mature oak trees that framed the winding driveway. Amara looked around in complete disbelief. I think there must be some mistake, she whispered to the driver. This cannot possibly be the right address. Before she could check the message again, a courteous attendant opened the car door with a respectful smile. Good evening, Miss Johnson. Mr. Bennett has been looking forward to your visit. She followed him through polished wooden doors into a grand entrance hall where crystal chandeliers cast warm light across marble floors. Every detail reflected quiet elegance rather than extravagance. Arthur stood waiting near the fireplace with the same gentle smile she remembered from the grocery store. You came, he said happily. Thank you. Amara embraced him lightly before laughing nervously. I have to admit, I did not expect this. Arthur smiled knowingly. There is someone I would like you to meet. Before she could ask another question, footsteps echoed from the curved staircase. Overlooking the foyer, Amara turned instinctively, and her breath caught. Descending the stairs with calm confidence was the same man she had helped find a bus route only 2 days earlier. He was no longer dressed in faded work clothes. Instead, he wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his posture composed, his presence unmistakably commanding. Behind him stood several professional staff members who immediately straightened the moment he appeared. Every person in the room acknowledged him with quiet respect before returning to complete silence. Lorenzo walked toward her with an expression that was warm yet thoughtful. We have met before, he said gently. Amara stared at him, searching for words. You were the man looking for the maintenance job. Lorenzo smiled softly. That was only part of the truth. Arthur stepped beside his grandson and rested a reassuring hand on Amara's shoulder. My dear, he said kindly, allow me to introduce my grandson, Lorenzo DeLuca. The room became completely silent as realization slowly spread across Amara's face. The name was impossible not to recognize. Newspapers, business magazines, and television interviews had mentioned it countless times. She looked from Arthur to Lorenzo and then back again, finally understanding why the grocery store security team had seemed unusually attentive and why every employee inside this magnificent home carried themselves with such careful professionalism. Lorenzo met her eyes with quiet sincerity before speaking the words that changed everything. You never knew who we were, he said. And that is exactly why I needed to know who you are. For several long seconds, Amara could not find her voice. She looked at Lorenzo, then at Arthur, trying to reconcile the kind man she had met at the bus stop with the influential businessman standing confidently before her. Nothing about the evening felt real anymore. Lorenzo noticed the uncertainty in her eyes and gestured toward the dining room with a reassuring smile. Please, he said softly. Tonight is only dinner. Nothing more. The warmth in his voice eased the tension just enough for Amara to follow Arthur into the beautifully lit dining room where fresh flowers decorated the center of a polished oak table. The meal itself was surprisingly simple. Homemade roasted chicken, fresh vegetables from a nearby farm, warm bread, and apple pie prepared from Arthur's favorite family recipe. There was no unnecessary extravagance, only conversation that slowly replaced uncertainty with comfort. Arthur laughed as he shared stories from his younger years, while Lorenzo listened more than he spoke, occasionally watching Amara with quiet admiration whenever she spoke about her mother, her co-workers, or the children at the community center. After dessert, Lorenzo stood and walked toward a nearby cabinet before returning with a neatly organized leather folder. He placed it gently in front of Amara. I would like to thank you, he said, not only for helping my grandfather, but for reminding me that character still exists without conditions. Amara looked at the folder but made no effort to open it. What is it? She asked cautiously. Inside is the deed to a small house close to your mother's doctor, complete medical coverage for both of you, and enough financial support to make sure you never have to worry about another grocery bill again. The room fell silent. Arthur watched quietly without interrupting. Amara slowly rested both hands on the folder before carefully pushing it back across the table. Lorenzo looked genuinely surprised. You do not have to refuse out of politeness, he said. This is my family's way of expressing gratitude. Amara smiled gently, though her eyes glistened with emotion. Mr. DeLuca, if I accepted all of this because I helped one person, then the reason I helped your grandfather would no longer be the same. Lorenzo remained silent. She continued carefully. I never expected anything in return. If I had known who he was, I hope I still would have made exactly the same decision. That is the only version of myself I want to become." Arthur's eyes softened with unmistakable pride. Lorenzo looked down at the folder for a long moment before quietly closing it. For perhaps the first time in years, someone had declined something he offered without hesitation, not because it was insufficient, but because accepting it would have compromised their own principles. Arthur finally broke the silence. "Amara," he said warmly, "what if gratitude does not have to be a reward? What if it can become an opportunity?" She looked toward him with curiosity. Arthur smiled. "Lorenzo and I have spoken at length about the community center where you volunteer. We learned that many families wait months for food assistance because there are simply not enough resources." Lorenzo nodded. "Instead of giving something only to you, we would like to invest in the work you already believe in. A new community kitchen, expanded classrooms, scholarships for local students, and a permanent grocery pantry that anyone can use with dignity. You would lead the project, but it would belong to the neighborhood, not to us." Tears slowly gathered in Amara's eyes as she realized the difference. This was not a prize for kindness. It was a chance to multiply it. She looked from Arthur to Lorenzo before quietly asking, "You really trust me with something this important?" Lorenzo smiled with complete certainty. "After everything I have seen these past few days, trusting you is the easiest decision I have made in a very long time." 6 months later, the neighborhood looked different in ways that could not be measured by new buildings alone. Every Saturday morning, families gathered outside the renovated community center long before sunrise, not because they were desperate, but because they knew they would be welcomed with dignity. The new community kitchen filled the air with the comforting aroma of fresh bread and homemade soup. Shelves inside the grocery pantry were carefully stocked with healthy food, and no one was ever asked embarrassing questions before receiving help. Parents attended financial literacy classes while children read books in bright classrooms filled with laughter instead of uncertainty. Above the entrance, a simple bronze plaque read, "Kindness grows when it is shared," but nowhere did it mention the people who had made it possible. That had been Amara's only request. She continued arriving every weekend wearing the same comfortable sneakers and simple blue volunteer shirt, greeting every visitor by name whenever she could. Most people assumed she was simply another volunteer. Very few knew she directed the entire project. Fewer still knew who quietly funded its expansion. Across the street, parked beneath the shade of an old maple tree, a familiar gray pickup truck sat unnoticed among the other vehicles. Lorenzo rested one arm against the open window while Arthur smiled beside him, watching children carry bags of groceries home with their parents. "You still do not want anyone to know?" Arthur asked gently. Lorenzo shook his head. "If they thank anyone, they should thank her. She taught me that generosity is strongest when it asks for nothing in return." Arthur nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Your grandmother used to say that respect cannot be purchased. It can only be earned one choice at a time." Lorenzo smiled thoughtfully. "I finally understand what she meant." Just then, Amara stepped outside carrying 2 boxes of fresh produce. She noticed an elderly veteran struggling with a walker before immediately changing direction to help him load groceries into his car. She laughed at one of his stories, waved goodbye as he drove away, then turned back toward the entrance without ever realizing she was being watched. Lorenzo quietly reached into the center console and pulled out a worn transit card, the same one Amara had handed him weeks earlier when she believed he was simply a stranger who needed help finding his way across the city. He had kept it ever since, not because it held monetary value, but because it reminded him of the day someone with almost nothing had trusted him without hesitation. Arthur glanced at the card and smiled knowingly. "You never gave it back." Lorenzo looked toward the community center. "I replaced the balance the next morning," he replied with a quiet laugh. "But I could never replace what it represents." At that moment, Amara looked across the street and noticed the gray pickup truck. She recognized both men instantly and smiled before raising her hand in a simple wave. Lorenzo and Arthur waved back. No security teams approached. No formal introductions followed. The moment needed. Nothing more. 3 lives had crossed because one ordinary woman refused to let an elderly stranger leave a grocery store without the medicine he needed. She never asked who he was. She only saw someone who needed kindness. And because of that single decision, hundreds of families would eat together. Children would dream bigger than their circumstances, and an entire neighborhood would discover that compassion can accomplish what power alone never could. As the afternoon sun settled over the city, Lorenzo watched Amara disappear back through the community center doors, surrounded by neighbors whose lives had quietly become brighter. He smiled to himself, knowing that the greatest lesson he had ever learned did not come from boardrooms, wealth, or influence. It came from a woman who proved, day after ordinary day, that the strongest heart in any room is the one that chooses kindness before knowing who is watching. And on that day, the city remembered what true dignity looks like.